final in the Institute for Government's Making the Games series. Very many congratulations to those of you who've been to previous events in the series. First of all, I just want to give a quick plug that we're not going to talk about it very much today, but our report has now, as of today, been published, Making the Games by Emma Norris, Johnny Medland, and me. Anyway, so you can read that online, you can read about it. It means the IFG has its first ever appearance on the Sky Sports website. So that's a breakthrough impact in at least one sense. So what we're going to do today is not go back over the lessons of London 2012. London 2012 was in many ways so last year. But of course the premise on which the Olympic Games were sold was that they would leave a legacy for sport, a legacy for London, and a wider legacy for the country. And that's what we're going to explore in today's thing. So we've got an absolutely fantastic panel, and I'm going to introduce them in the order I'm going to get them to speak, which will be a bit of a warning to them. On my immediate left, we have Katherine Grainger, who's a 4-time Olympic rowing medalist, 6-time world champion. I think probably provided us one of the really emotional moments of the Games when she finally got that elusive gold.
I can say that.
Anyway, so that was brilliant. But actually, for the rest of the time, Katherine, and I didn't know this until I got these bios, is studying for a PhD in the School of Law at King's College London, researching homicide. I was wondering whether I could find a way to attract her to apply for the IFG intern programme, but I don't think homicide is one of our specialities, but we're branching out. Second, and in a change to the billing, Liz Nicholl, very unfortunately, is a victim of the snow. She's not that bad a victim of the snow, I have to say, but we can discuss that in the drinks afterwards. We're absolutely delighted that in her place we have the chair of UK Sport, Baroness Sue Campbell, who's been chair of UK Sport, and actually has been this fantastic double act, I think, with Liz since she was brought in to sort out UK Sport. And she's going to talk about that. Then we're going to go to Neale Coleman. Neale makes many appearances in our report. Neale was the mayor's advisor actually when the Olympic bid was not really even being thought of, and I think, you know, maybe he was the person who convinced Ken that to put his hatred of sport aside and actually go for it. But Neale was the rock of continuity, managed the transition within London, and is now managing a new transition and has moved over to work on the London Legacy Development Corporation. He's going to tell us about what the Olympics could mean for London, and what the legacy could mean for London. And we're going to give the last word to Hugh Robertson. Hugh also makes a lot of appearances in our report because he's also someone who's stayed with the Games throughout, and his current incarnation is as Minister for Sport, Tourism and Olympic Legacy. So his job title's moved on since the summer in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So they're all going to contribute for about 10 minutes each, and then, as in our early events, we're going to give you all the opportunity to quiz them, talk to them about whatever you want. But in a change to our normal programme, we're actually going to have a sort of little brief awards ceremony. At IFG, we enjoyed the summer when we had lots of awards ceremony practices going on, and Jeremy Hunt won a lot of medals in the practice ceremonies, at the very least, for the Olympic marathons and the cycling. But one of the things when we were doing this report we were incredibly impressed by was a very scary chart that is on the wall at UK Sport, which showed exactly the way in which UK Sport, which is a hugely performance-driven organisation, tracked performance. And Institute for Government's really interested in the use of management information and performance management in government. And so we've made UK Sport the winner of December, I think, Inspiration for Government Award. And I'm going to pass over to our director, Peter Riddle, just to make an award to Baroness Campbell.
Just welcome you all here. I mean, we could have made the award to lots of people in this room who were involved with the Olympics. I see Jonathan Stevens there, Tessa Jowell, and Katherine. We can't really cap a gold medal at Eton Dorney. We'll try, but we won't do that. The Inspiration for Government Award started a year ago to reward and recognise innovation and good practice in government. And we've had the awards regularly every month or so since then. And it's nominated by members of the staff here, and I and one of my colleagues decide on it. Absolutely no doubt in this case who should go to, because the clear success of what happened, what Jill's just described. And the award, which I'll give to Baroness Campbell in a minute, to recognise the work on Mission 2012. That's certainly mission accomplished, a phrase which perhaps oughtn't to be used in other contexts, but in this case it could be resoundingly used. The reporting process that Jill's referred to, and that the UK sport eventually created Olympic and Paralympic medal targets in cooperation with the sports themselves, very demanding in its operation on that, and also it was a transparent process, so the press could look and see what was happening. The rigorous planning with UK elite athletes like Katherine helped people to prepare for their full potential, bringing the impressive tally of 65 Olympic medals and 120 Paralympic medals. Work's already started on Rio 2016. So we want to give this award in recognition of all the work we felt you've done, and also our appreciation of everything involved in the Olympics in the project which Jill has so successfully managed. So whilst a lot of other people here could have this, Mission 2012, delighted to give you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Oh, picture, sorry. Can I thank you very much indeed for this. It means a great deal to me, but very importantly, it means a great deal to my extremely hard-working colleagues at UK Sport. The work that went in and has gone in over 10 years to produce those results you saw in London is a testament to the colleagues I have at UK Sport, but also to all of the governing bodies, their performance directors, their coaches, the sports scientists, the sports medics, everybody that makes up our high-performance system. And I think the trick was getting us on one team, one mission, one dream, one set of beliefs, and I'll talk a little more about that. But the focus of our ambition was Katherine and her colleagues, because we wanted to give them the very best chance to succeed in their home games in front of this wonderful nation of ours. So thank you very much, and I accept this on behalf of all of my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I think it's an almost perfect introduction. So, Katherine.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, finally. And I keep hearing that word, finally. She finally did it. Finally did it. It makes a better story, though. I'm going to shamelessly go back to 2012. Although I know it's 2013, but I'm going to live in 2012 forevermore, I think, anyway. And also shamelessly talk about the emotion behind it. As an athlete, it was a side that none of us predicted on the scale it came. Sport for me is something that I never intended to get into in a serious way or as a career, certainly. I went to university to study law, so I'm studying homicide now. There's no practical element of that at all, can I just reassure you? So you're entirely safe. But I took this massive tangent in my life that sport led me down, and I have been thankful every day for that different direction I took. I've been very, very lucky to have wonderful parents behind me who encouraged me, my dad particularly, to still finish my degree, just in case something went wrong, but to also try opportunities that fell to me and to try anything new that came my way. And certainly when I started in the 90s, sport wasn't seen as something you could do as a career as such. And it's just massively changed in this country that now it's an option for young people. What happened in 2012 though, and I feel I'm kind of qualified to talk about the emotional side. In our boat, there's Anna and myself. Anna is very rational, logical, mathematician in the background. When we get all these biomechanics and stuff, we get reams and reams of paper, graphs and detail, and she'll look at it and go, wow, this means, the depth of blade is this, and the split second here, and all the rest. And I go, oh, that's pretty colours. And she brings this incredible thinking to what we do, and I bring the kind of the more emotional side of it and the heart and soul. And you do need an incredible mix of them both to do anything very, very successfully. And for me, sport has been sport transcends so many things. People that I've met through sport, people who have succeeded through sport, come from different backgrounds, different ages, different races, different cultures, different religions, different everything. It transcends everything. It's something that the opportunities for anyone to understand it. The simplicity is at its essence. It's a simple thing to understand for any age, and it's a simple thing for anyone to take part in who wants to. It's got a wonderful, it's like great music, like great art. It's got a soul to it that really, really changes people's lives and makes it better. And we saw it last summer on a scale that we've never, ever seen before. I still go around the country now, all over the place, and it moved far beyond London. It really was a British pride that captured the nation. I've been lucky enough to have complete strangers coming up in tears, talking about when they watched my race, when they watched other bits of the race. And sport has this unbelievable magic to it and this gift. And yes, we could all list all the benefits that, from the health benefits to the socialisation to people learning to win, learning to lose, learning to work in teams, learning to have goals, time management. There's all these very obvious things that are huge benefits, but there's so much more to it. There's an essence to it that can reach everyone. And last summer we saw it reach everyone. There's this enthusiasm, excitement absolutely pulsing through the country right now. And we are going to be absolute idiots if we don't capture it. For me, legacy is already in place in so many ways. We've got incredible new structures, we've got things in place, we've got support systems and coaches and individuals and clubs all set up and running. And that's been part of the legacy. But for me, harnessing that inspiration would be a true legacy. It's much harder to define or to count, and yet it's going to be about providing opportunity to anybody, to a new Olympic generation we've created by this summer, where anyone who wants to take part can take part. And when we started, it was all about inspiring the next generation, inspiring a new generation. But I've met so many people in the last 6 months of all ages. So yes, the 5-year-olds have been inspired, but the 65-year-olds have been equally inspired. And they need to have that opportunity to do things too. It's about getting people active, getting people taking part, not necessarily in organised sport, but just in activities. If we give everyone in this country who wants to do something, as far as activity is concerned, the opportunity to do it, then we've created a legacy that will last. And Seb Coe stood in the closing ceremony and said, we'll look back and we can say we did it right. But actually we need to look back and say, this next part we did right, because it would be an utter waste of 2 wonderful weeks of Olympic sport, 2 wonderful weeks of Paralympic sport, to think it was left in 2012. Because yes, it's now part of history, but it also needs to be a starting point of what comes next. And I cannot tell you the enthusiasm I see constantly every day, even now, when I go around and talk to people about the Games. I thought I'd be the one dragging people back to the past, going, let's talk about London again. But I'm actually trying to come up with a new conversation because everyone's talking to me about London still. I try and talk about murder, and just not interested. And it has become bigger and better and more than we ever hoped. And it's not just about sport, but it's, the ongoing projects are about education as well. And the Olympic values, there's 7 Olympic and Paralympic values. And if we can get people to live by those, which include respect and determination and inspiration, that's what changes our country. And that's what gives people this incredible feeling at the moment we have where things are possible, that anything's possible. That we're not just plucky underdogs anymore in Britain, we're actually really assured trailblazers. And that's where we should be, across business, across science, across art, across sport, across so many different areas. If we harness this feeling now, then you genuinely feel that anything's possible. And there's a great bit at the end of my race with one of the commentators, Gary Herbert. And we're coming in front of the stands, and there's 30,000 people in those stands. Absolutely deafening noise, especially magnified on a water sort of situation. And we came in rowing, you row into it's like rowing into a stadium. It gets louder and louder and completely encapsulates you. And the commentary as we go past right in front of this crowd is just, ladies and gentlemen, what you're watching now is that dreams do come true. And that was the Olympics. And if anything, it should teach people to dream and to follow those dreams, because I tell you what, when they come true, they're pretty special.
but I'm sure Sue's up for it. I'm just going to do a very quick intro, because we very briefly introduced Sue as the chair of UK Sport. Catherine's not the only international athlete on the panel. Sue also competed internationally in netball and the pentathlon. But she's also, not just at UK Sport, but she also chairs the Youth Sport Trust. So in a sense, you're the sort of maker of future dreams, because you've also seen what happened to Australia at the last Olympics with the sort of, you know, is there a legacy decay on T+12? So what's the sort of risk for wherever hosts the Olympics in 11 years' time about that? But also, is that success in elite sport actually going to translate maybe over to the other side, the other organisations, Sport England, wider participation, a fitter nation, a nation not just of supremely good spectators, which we proved to be the rest of us, not Catherine, in 2012, but actually a nation that is more active in sport and participating. Sue.
Okay, you've asked me some questions there I wasn't prepared to answer, but I'll work at it. What I wanted to do really was to try to, in terms of explaining the legacy that I think we now have in our high performance system, which is where I'll start at UK Sport, is really just again, and forgive me, a little bit of history, but it'll only take a minute or so. I think we have to go back to Atlanta, and in Atlanta we won 1 gold medal and we were 36th in the medal table. I think you can say we were in special measures. You know, we were struggling. Then came the lottery. Thanks to John Major, lottery was introduced. And what that did was, Catherine quite rightly said, from 97 onwards, it allowed our athletes to make a choice, to decide to go full-time, or at least to have the option to go full-time. Not all of them chose that. But just as importantly, it allowed us to put in the system great coaches, better sports science and sports medicine, bring in professional performance directors. So what happened was we created a professional system. And very quickly we moved in Sydney, we came 10th in the medal table, which was a heck of a lot better than 36th. And when I came in 2003, invited by Tessa Jowell to go in as reform chair into UK Sport, her question to me was, we've gone from special measures to good, but are we capable of being great? Are we capable of going even further? And I didn't know the answer to the question. But I went in and started to ask the questions for myself. And of course, we all knew that Australia, bless them, were 4th in the medal table. And I couldn't understand for the life of me why they were 4th and we were 10th. And that's where my question started. Why is that? You know, they're a smaller population, and I know the sun shines more, and everybody gave me all that, but it doesn't sometimes shines far too much. So I wanted to understand, why were we not there? And the answer came back to me, and I think Catherine said it really well, was that we were almost satisfied to be there. We didn't have a culture that said, you know, we are amongst the best in the world, we can be trailblazers, we can be leaders. We weren't sure that we could. And so the question was, how did you change the culture? How did you change the culture that said, we're not satisfied with good, we actually want to be better than good? And I could talk for an hour on that, but I'm not going to. But that was a fundamentally important thing. And we introduced something that was called no compromise. And we changed, that's somebody ringing in to say that they don't like no compromise. But we introduced this thing called no compromise. And the concept sounds really harsh. It didn't mean it was uncompromising. It meant no compromise. And what that was about setting a bar. It was about saying to people, if you want to be the very best in the world, you cannot compromise. There is no halfway to being the best in the world. You're either aspiring to be the best in the world or you're not. And therefore there can be no compromise on this journey. And that meant no compromise in the people you employed, no compromise in the support you gave your athletes, no compromise in your attitude to this. And what happened was some sports got that very quickly. And some didn't, and some still haven't, may I say. But more and more have. And what you saw in London was 16 sports that have actually understood that now. They've not only understood that, but they've actually been able to embrace it and embed it in what they do. And I remember at a press conference very early on after Athens, we cut the funding for gymnastics quite dramatically. And the chair of British Gymnastics, who I've known for 30 years, agreed to come and sit on the panel, and the media said to him, "You must hate this woman." And he said, "Well, she's not my favourite person at the moment. She's taking my money away. But you know, I get it. I get the message. We aren't good enough yet. But one day I'll look that woman in the eye and I'll say, world class, you give me my money." And when the boys won that medal in gymnastics, he stood crying in the stand. And I went over, long enough to say, "Now, lady, we're world class. Give me my money." That's what you want, isn't it? That's what you're trying to do when you're investing public money. You're trying to raise aspiration and drive and determination to excel. Not just distribute money. It's easy to distribute money. You can all write checks for people, but how do you invest it to drive a cultural change, a real desire to be the best? The second thing for me was, and all of this is part of our legacy, because that culture is there. It's not going away. We're not going to have succeeded in London and fail in Rio. We're going to go on. And we're actually going to succeed in more sports in Rio, because it's now contagious. Everybody wants to be in there. Everybody wants a part of this excellence. They want to be part of this one team, one mission concept. But we also have to be better at business planning. And some of you may or may not know that once we'd won the games, we went to visit the Treasury to ask for a very significant increase in our funding. And the young man that I had recruited to be the architect for me of the high performance system, a man called Peter Keane, pulled that business plan together. We presented that business plan in 2005 to Treasury. And we gave Treasury 10 options. If you give us this, we'll give you this number of medals. You give us this, we'll give you this number of medals and this number. Which do you want? And Treasury said, "Well, can't you get that with less money?" I'm sure that's very familiar. And we said, "No, it's a business case. It's not a, we haven't put a finger in the air. We know what this is going to take." And they opted for 4th place. And how many medals do you think we told them in 2005 we would win in 2012? It's in the business case. I'm not making this up. 65. That's not bad business planning, is it? That is pretty sharp, because that's exactly what we did win. And I think that shows you that just happened to come along, or happened because it was a Home Olympics, or happened because somebody gave us a bit more money. It happened because it was incredibly well managed, and the architecture of it was really clear. And that architecture will live on. That architecture isn't going to go away. I'm incredibly optimistic that we will be the first nation in history that does better in the Olympics following the Home Olympics. No other nation's ever done it. I believe this nation will do it, and that's part of the legacy. I think the other thing that we got the award for, and that I think is really important, is how you create, when you're investing in this kind of way, how you create a sense of self-reliance and accountability. And often when public is invested, it gets policed. And we were very similar. We would invest and then we'd police. And I wanted to change, I wanted sports to develop 2012 was. It was a mission board which sports reported back on a quarterly basis how they thought they were doing. And you can imagine when they first did it what colour everything was, can't you? Green. Okay, everything was green, right across the board. Everybody was green. And so I said, I started to ask questions. Surely there must be something you don't think is perfect. Oh, no. And why? Because they thought the moment they put up amber or red, we'd take their money away. And the moment we encouraged them to show us a red, and instead of punishing, we actually got behind them and solved the red with them, the next time we went, everything was amber and red. Because everybody then realised it accessed more resource, not less. Okay, it accessed real expertise to solve the problem. And what's happened is now we get a much more honest appraisal, a self-review. That's the maturity of the business. And again, in 16 sports, I would argue now they're operating like a really good business would review its progress, its productivity, what it's doing on a regular basis. There are some still got a long way to go and don't have a clear reflection of themselves. And you know, that's where the no compromise approach appears tough, but it's unrelenting, and it will drive the success we want. And finally, in terms of the value-added stuff that we wanted to add, so you invest money, and then you have to say, okay, we're investing money in a strategic framework, we're creating self-review, we're driving a belief that we can succeed, but there are elements of this programme that need a different level of push. And those for us were coaching, talent identification, and research and innovation. And Catherine's, the first medal in rowing, had in it two young ladies, Helen Glover and Heather Stanning. Helen Glover was discovered walking through Trafalgar Square when we were doing a talent recruitment campaign for tall people. Tall people. Sorry, Catherine. Tall people in a boat make a boat go fast, long levers, okay? We did a campaign in the middle of Trafalgar Square. She happened to be walking through. She happened to sign up. And 3 years, 9 months later, she wins a gold medal at the Olympics. So there are people in our communities with enormous talent in this country that just walking by through Trafalgar Square, you never know who's there. Secondly, in coaching, we gave personalised support to every single coach working with every athlete, an offer of personalised support. Because at the end of the day, the next most important person after the athlete is the coach. There is no substitute for great coaches. And thirdly, in research and innovation, we sought out the best knowledge. We worked with McLaren, BAE Systems, every university we could get our hands on to say, we want to know what you know. We want to be standing at the cutting edge of performance. So our legacy is all of that is still there. It will go on, it will build, and I believe it will get driven on into the future. So for me, we've got 3 big pieces to our legacy, all of which have been part of our strategy in the past. A major events programme, where we used our major events, working with London 2012 to give our athletes home country advantage, to train our technical administrators and volunteers. But we're going to drive on with that major event strategy. It's a very successful one. We're now the most successful nation in the world bidding for international events to be brought here. We've got an incredible legacy of facilities we want to maximise, but we've got an incredible legacy of volunteers we want to maximise. Secondly, we promised the world, promised the world that if London got the games, we would take the world to sport to young people around the world. Thanks to Tessa Jowell, we started a programme called International Inspiration. We've worked in 20 developing countries. We've reached 13 million children, and that programme will go on and we'll build on it in the future, which has helped us with our international influence. And finally, the high-performance system. The most important legacy we've got are our athletes. They are giving back every day to our community. I could not endorse more strongly what Catherine said. If you ask me where the greatest, most important legacy can be left, it's in our schools with our children. And if we do not get that bit right, then I'm afraid all the promises in the world won't make up for what we don't get right. School sport, primary age youngsters, secondary age youngsters being given a love of moving, activity, sport, and all that it brings that Catherine articulated brilliantly. So I'm really positive about the high performance legacy. I really want to see that dream that Seb had of lighting the fire in every young person in this country through sport realised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to Neale, who, as I said, has been with the project from the start, and I'm not quite sure whether he managed to convince the sport folk, Ken Livingstone, that the Olympics was a price worth paying for getting slugs of government money into London. But one of the very important pieces of legacy is the regeneration around the east, around the park, but also wider impacts. And I think we read in the press today that there's quite a significant shift west to east that Live Nation has given up, annoying the people who live just north of Bayswater Road and having the plug pulled on them at 11 o'clock in the evening, even when they've got Bruce Springsteen and Paul McCartney on stage, and have decided to go for the Olympic Stadium as their venue of choice next summer. But Neale is going to tell us actually how the legacy for London is going to be realised. Neale.
Thanks, Jill. I was able once to get Ken to go and watch Amir Khan box in Athens, and I didn't quite make him a boxing fan, but he enjoyed the fight. My current boss, the current Mayor of London, has a habit of introducing or framing a series of remarks around words that he expects no one to know the meaning of. And I thought I'd try this today with the benefit of a piece that appeared in the Daily Telegraph recently, which is to start with the word catachresis. And apparently what catachresis is a process whereby words or phrases take on more and more meanings and connotations, and particularly where words that have started off being really meaning something rather nice turn into universal blame phrases. And I think the classic example used in this piece was political correctness. But the suggestion in this rather well-written piece in the Daily Telegraph was that the next candidate for catachresis was the phrase Olympic legacy. And as he said in the piece, there are early signs, and they are but early. Like good Scotch, good catachresis takes years to perfect. And it's worth just quoting a bit more from, because it is very good. And there is a serious point, which I will come to eventually, saying, you know, it's interesting to consider what people were expecting Britain's Olympic legacy to look like. Vast numbers appear to have mistaken it for some sort of halcyon, Danny Boyle-curated Elysium. Live, smiling children skip through emerald-encrusted streets, gleefully hurling javelins. Kenneth Branagh leans against a row of red brick houses, absent-mindedly reciting Shakespeare, while the Chariots of Fire music plays on a loop. To whooping crowds, the wildly popular Michael Gove announces the construction of 100,000 new velodromes on existing brownfield sites. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that when the reality fails to keep pace with the reverie, it's the legacy rather than the reverie that is blamed. Tube out of service? So much for our Olympic legacy. Just seen a fat kid eating a packet of crisps? Is that what Lord Coe meant by Olympic legacy? 4 consecutive days of rain? What sort of Olympic legacy is that, Lord Coe? So I think there is a vaguely serious point here, and it comes sort of out of, in fact, the Institute for Government report. And when they first talk about legacy, they actually are quite critical in some ways about the approach to legacy through the games, and they talk about there having been legacy clutter in the early stages, by which I think they meant that, you know, anybody who had any objective under the sun naturally decided that it was going to be part of the Olympic legacy. And I think there's something in that. One of the things that they say, and they quote, I think, a former Downing Street advisor, it clearly is a former Downing Street advisor, that if they could have chosen just one thing and, say, made it school sport, then maybe it would have been rather more difficult to make the changes that had been made to the school sports programmes. But I'm not sure this is quite right, because I think it's no surprise people latch on to a huge and unique project like this. And you can look at a whole range of achievements right across the board in so many different fields. I mean, for example, I think the record and the practice of the ODA in terms of construction, health and safety was an astonishing legacy from the Games. The fact that actually the health and safety record in the construction of the Olympic Park was as good as the health and safety record of a normal office building was an astonishing achievement, and one which can be replicated and should be replicated across future construction projects. Similarly, the ODA achieved a huge amount in the sustainability area, on the use of materials, in approaches to how it used coolants, in approaches to how it used PVC, what it did on disability access within the park. So I think actually one has to be a little careful before putting down the fact that we did try and do so many things through the Games. Equally, legacy by its nature is something that's supposed to happen afterwards. And I think actually, in fact, an awful lot, and this is true in all the fields of the legacy, was there before the Games. It came early. And if you look at London in particular, fantastic benefits from particularly the huge transport programme. And I think this really can't be overstated. We actually got programme of something like 6 billion of investment in new public transport in London associated with the Games. Now, probably not all of it wouldn't have happened eventually, but there's no doubt that some very, very big projects wouldn't have happened without the Games. I think about the East London Line extension, which generally these days people call the Overground mainly, and that's a project that I know personally wouldn't have happened without the Games. It was put in to help our bid, and Tessa and colleagues in the Department for Transport then made a huge effort to get that in after our initial proposals had been strongly criticised. I suspect that we would even, had we hadn't been doing the Games, had difficulty completing that huge Northern Ticket Hall at King's Cross, which overran and which needed extra money, but which is absolutely vital to the success of that station and to the regeneration around King's Cross. And that investment in the Overground has completed London's inner orbital rail system. You can now go all the way around. It benefits the whole of London, from Richmond to Crystal Palace. A fantastic achievement, the most reliable railway in the country, and it used to be absolutely ghastly, as anyone who used the old North London Line trains, which hardly ever turned up and were filthy and dirty when they did. And you can see what that's done in places not just out in Stratford. Look at what's happened in Dalston, where the tube was brought to Hackney, and the fantastic renaissance there, the housing that's going in the way there, the way that area is booming now. Stratford, of course, particularly fantastic transport accessibility. We saw it at Games time, one train every 45 seconds going in and out of those stations. The way in which we cleared the park much more quickly, actually, than we had. I mean, we were over-anxious all the time, and in fact, it was much easier in the event, thanks to not just the investment, but to some terrific performance by the people who staffed and managed and ran the transport system. But that has created so much opportunity in Stratford and in that broad area of East London. And obviously one of the things which certainly Ken Livingstone, although he, as has been said, was not a great sports fan, I well recall when the BOA first came to see him I think in 2002, to ask him to support the London bid. He said he would do it, but strictly on the condition that the bid was in East London, that it was based in the Lower Lee Valley, and that it was all about regeneration. And one of the other interesting things that comes out of the Making the Games report, I think, is something on the budget. And actually completely new to me and very interesting, was that, in fact, there's been a lot of a lot of analysis of the way the budget went from 2.375 to 9.3. We can argue about the detail there. But the interesting thing about that, which this report brings out, is actually the cost of the Olympic venues in the event was less than the number that had been assumed in the 2.375 number. And the reasoning, and what that shows, is that actually where the bulk of the extra money and the investment went was into transport, into infrastructure, into new connections, into permanent legacy things that will last and will go on for a long time. And that you can see down there. One of the first things that we did when we came back from Singapore was to get underway the project to bury the huge overhead power lines that used to disfigure that area in 10-metre tunnels underground. £350 million project, something people had wanted to do for years and years and years. Never ever would that have happened without the Games. Equally, never ever would have happened, or at least not to the timetable, without the Games, the huge private investment that Westfield's put into that area, the 1.5 billion that they've been quite clear they would never have done without the Games, at a time when, in the depths of the sort of complete collapse of credit markets across the world, they stopped every project in the world they were doing, apart from their headquarters in Sydney and the Games. And that, of course, has done a huge amount to transform Stratford. 10,000 new jobs, 2,000 for the long-term unemployed, and some fantastic new employers in that area now. Marks and Spencer's and John Lewis really doing some terrific work in the community, in the skills, and showing the way for the future. So all that was there before the games, we've got new power stations there, new combined heat and power stations servicing the whole of the area, all the utilities sized for a housing development that can and will follow in the lower Lee Valley there, and those power stations potential to run on renewable gas, so the potential to do real zero carbon housing development throughout that area, and just fantastic opportunity there. One other quarrel with the IIG report. I think the other area where they're critical about legacy is on legacy structure, where they say that we didn't really have that sorted out as well as we should. Again, I don't completely disagree with the comments, but I think one could have acknowledged the fact that unlike anywhere else, London did succeed in having a legacy vehicle up and running well before the Games, years before the Games, in unscrambling a lot of very complicated financial and land issues that, gave a lot of us sleepless nights and worse to do. But that meant that we were in a position where, before the Games, we had let all the contracts for all the venues, apart from the stadium and the IBC MPC. We had an outline planning consent before the Games for all the post-Games development, and we'd let the first contract for the first new housing scheme after the Games. And of course we have the village that will be handed over this year. We have 2,800 new homes there, half of it affordable, much of it to be institutionally financed private rented housing, something that people in London have been saying, we wish we could do that for years, and we want to do a lot more of that, I think, in Stratford. It will enable us to bring forward the housing more quickly, to do it alongside affordable housing. And really, I think we've gone on quite well since the Games. We've done this letting to BT Sport in the Broadcast Centre, which is a fantastic stroke of, I wouldn't say good fortune, excellent planning and whatever, but it's perfect, and that will really provide us with the sort of anchor tenant for that centre that we want. We're looking soon, I think, to get a big higher education provider into that centre as well, which is very exciting, one that also has quite a lot of connections with sport, I'm pleased to say, and we're having some very productive discussions with them. As was said by Jill, today we announced that we are going to run some very big events in the stadium and in the park in the summer, so just 1 year after the Games. I think I'm not breaking too many confidences by saying that I hope within the next week or so we will announce some big sporting events in the park next summer, which I think will be extremely exciting. So one of the things that I'm talking to the Live Nation guys, which has really pleased me, is that they've been talking to people in the States, agents, artists, most of it. I tell them you've got to have people who appeal to people my age. So we've got to have Fleetwood Mac, we've got to have the Eagles, we're going to, and fortunately these are the sorts of bands that apparently fill stadiums. So there's every chance we may get some of them. But the thing that is so pleasing is the feedback from Live Nation is these people are really, really excited by the thought they're going to play in this stadium. They're just, and these are pretty hard-nosed bands and agents, and they want to come to Stratford. They really want to come and play in that park. They've seen it on the television. They know what a fantastic place it is. And I think that's just another sign of the huge and fantastic legacy that the Games have left us there, and the huge opportunities that we've still got and that we can deliver on in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Neale. I was going to say that I think we do somewhere in our report say that we think that London is actually massively advanced on securing the physical legacy compared to any other Games. So it's not all quite as gloomy as you say we say. But anyway, but finally, I want to pass on to Hugh Robertson. Hugh features, as I said, a lot in our report because he's actually lived with the Games as long as Tessa Jowl in many ways in our front row today, participated in one of our earlier events. But now falls the government to take legacy forward to oversee it. So, Hugh, thought we'd give you the
Thank you very
final
much.
word.
The great thing is that Tessa wears it much better than me, which is it's the real thing. What I thought I'd do really was just talk for a couple of minutes about some of the key lessons that are contained in the report, and then just finish very quickly with a couple of lessons on legacy. It is worth remembering, I mean, I always say this, do remember in this project where we started, and when I first got involved in it back in 2004, Tessa very generously opened the department up and said, come for a brief on the bid. And I seem to remember somebody saying to me, I wouldn't worry too much because we're some way behind Madrid and a very long way behind Paris. And for all the work that Tessa had done assembling this alliance, there was absolutely no certainty at that stage that we were ever going to win, or the events of last summer were, as a result, going to become possible. So it is just worth remembering that how far we have come on this whole journey. I thought I'd just sort of pick out 5 things that I thought, as the government minister and actually an opposition spokesman beforehand, had made a difference to this process. The first, and it's a very good thing that Tessa is here, because I can now embarrass her publicly rather than having to do so without her here. When politicians talk about the importance of cross-party support, almost everybody who's not a politician turns off and goes to sleep. Over a 7-year period of the Olympic Games, it is almost inevitable that you will have a change of government. John Goodbody tapped me, the Olympics correspondent of the Times, tapped me on the shoulder the night we won the bid in Singapore and said, what's the good news for you tonight? And I sort of looked at him a little blankly and said, well, presumably you've just won the Olympic Games, John, silly question. And he said, no, only once in the last century has the same government that won a bid delivered a Games. And the answer is Barcelona, actually, that is the only time it happened in the last century. So over the course of signing the host nation contract, when you win it, and delivering a Games, there will almost certainly be a change of government. That requires a considerable amount of discipline if the thing is not going to become a matter of political knocking copy. And I pay enormous tribute to the work that Tessa did in setting this whole process up, the openness with which, as an opposition, we were involved in the process, briefed on everything, so that when I became the government minister, and I think this is picked up in the report, there was nothing, when I picked up that very complicated series of Olympic budgets, there was nothing in it that was a surprise. And if anybody in the room, all you experts in government, can think of another project where that is the case, I'd be quite impressed to know about it. But it wasn't just at political level, actually. A great many of the officials who were involved in it stayed with the project right the way through, which meant that we had an enormous store of technical expertise to fall back on whenever anything went wrong. Paul Dighton said to me in May 2010, when I took this over, he said, you do realise how this works, don't you? If it's a success, all sorts of people that you and I have never heard of will come out of the woodwork and claim it's down to them. And he paused and he looked at me and said, if it goes wrong, you'll get the sack. And I have to say, that wasn't entirely a bad bit of advice. The second thing that I think was really important in the way that this project was set up was to establish, this is another phrase, I mean, it's almost worse than catachresis, this one actually. If you talk about corporate governance, that is normally the moment at which most reasonable and rational people go to sleep. But the way the project was set up meant that there were a series of organisations covering the range of this very complicated project, all of whom knew what their job was and what their job wasn't. And actually there was remarkably little territory pinching or punch-ups or anything else like that. The IOC said to me when I was the opposition spokesman, I went over to Switzerland, I said, what do you want from a government? Very interesting answer when delivering at Olympics. They said 5 things. We want the government to maintain the overall strategy, to look after the budget, to deliver the security, to make the transport work, and look after the legacy. We do not want you to build the park or manage the competition. And actually that was, I think, like all those big picture things, it's a bit broad brush, but it's pretty good advice. And the governance structures and the clear boundaries that were contained within them, I think was one of the reasons why the project was such a success. And I would absolutely endorse what Neale said. I also actually thought that the report was a little bit unfair on the legacy, because actually no other host city has had 6 of its 8 venues let 3 months before a Games. This is not easy to do by any manner of means, and it is a real achievement to the work done by the Olympic Park Legacy Company and Baroness Ford that worked. The third thing I was just going to talk about a little bit was leadership. we talked about the sort of political leadership of the project, but actually we were fortunate to get incredibly high quality people from both the public and the private sector who worked together to deliver this. And if you look at the talents of people like John Armitt and David Higgins on the building side, or Seb Cohen and Paul Dighton, often partnerships that had very complementary talents. If you look at Seb, I mean, he's well known in the Olympic world. He's an athlete par excellence. He has those political skills that enabled him to sort of move the thing around at a high level. And in Paul Dighton, he had the chief operating officer of Goldman Sachs, who could pull the levers and make things work. And those high-grade and complementary partnerships were, I think, a key part of the success. The fourth thing, and this must, I think, almost be the great lesson for government projects, is start early. And actually in 2000, by the time the Act had passed through Parliament, it's a good question actually this, which is, there were two acts of Parliament, two major acts of Parliament, the original Olympic Act in 2005 and then the Amendment Act in 2011. Unusually, the same three politicians were involved at the end of the third reading of the Amendment Act, as had led for their parties at the start of the second reading of the original Act. And that just doesn't happen in politics any other time that I can think of. But getting that bill into the House early enabled the ODA to get going early, so by very early 2006, the site was secured. If you look at the slide pack of site in 2007, 8, 9, 10, by 2010, the thing is pretty much, you can absolutely see the shape of the park. That meant it was largely finished by 2011, which gave us all of the final year to test and refine and make sure that things, that things didn't go wrong. And that was a crucial part in the success of it. And the final thing I was going to mention, they always used to tell us this when I was a cadet at Sandhurst, talk about military operations and the importance of maintenance of momentum. It's very true with big government projects, actually. You've got to keep going forward. And we all laughed a little bit as we turned up to celebrate the 452nd day to the start of the Olympics with some event in Trafalgar Square involving a torch and something else going on. But actually, it did allow the project to communicate to the outside world that things were constantly moving forward and were happening, and there was a successful outcome at the end of it. And it's very easy to laugh about communication strategies, but this process of maintaining momentum was very important in the whole thing. There are a number of other things we could talk about. Security may well come up, volunteers, and actually the importance of remembering these things are all about sport, which is often forgotten in all the other challenges. The one thing I thought I would just stress is that you were quite critical about, or you sounded a warning note about the use of innovation. I think one of the extraordinary things about this project is that the way the Olympic Park has showcased the very best of building innovation in this country. And if you look at Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Centre, or you look at the amount of steel in the stadium, or the design of the velodrome, these are fantastic state-of-the-art facilities that are the very best of their sort anywhere in the world, that our athletes say are the very best of their sort anywhere in the world, and other people are now very interested in getting us to build for them. So actually, I sort of understand the point you're making, but actually that has been a great showcase of British property and British industry. Last minute on legacy. Absolutely, I hadn't heard catacresis before, but when I was in opposition, I saw a huge number of people who wanted to come and see me about their particular legacy plans. And I sort of decided about 6 months out from the election I was going to stop doing this when a group came to see me about horticulture. Because they thought this was bless them, I mean, it's very sweet, but they thought this was a wonderful opportunity to showcase the very best of British gardening. And it does, and I absolutely echo everything Neale said, that there was a huge temptation. I mean, it happened under both governments. Somebody loses funding for something, and they put their hands on their hips and say, so there goes my Olympic legacy. And it is very, very difficult to bring definition to this. I think we are now some of the way down that path with the 5 pillars. The economic pillar, the 13.5 billion of contracts, which I am confident we will deliver on the back of this. And if you look at the tourism figures, up 9% in November already on a year ago, there is I'm pretty certain that we will do this. If you look at the regeneration legacy, the second pillar that Neale has talked about, nobody can say anything else but that the area around Stratford has been transformed. The community legacy is difficult. I mean, I had a slightly worrying conversation with the chief executive of New Zealanders, the chief executive of the Rugby World Cup, who said we had this fantastic group of volunteers, and we thought we'll send them all down to Auckland Rugby Club on Saturday morning, or Christchurch Rugby Club, or wherever it is. He said you have to be realistic about this. Some will do that, but actually most people volunteer for something like this because they like being involved in national events, and actually using this resource for the wonderful list of world-class events that are coming to this country afterwards will, I think, be the way to to capitalise on all of that. The sport legacy Sue has talked about, and we're trying to define that in terms of 10 pillars. I won't go through them all now. And then the legacy for disability. We haven't mentioned that tonight thus far. I think there is a very compelling line that says for all the successes of the Olympics, the most remarkable part of this process was the success of the Paralympics. To have those stadia full, to have changed the attitude. I mean, I now see, when I get in the tube, I now see people going up to disabled people and chatting to them. It's very simple things like that. And I think it has really changed the terms of trade around all of this. And one final point in conclusion. I said that we've got these sort of 5 pillars. Having spent the sort of 6 months or so since the end of the Games, travelling around the world trying to sort of sell expertise a bit on the back of it, do you know what I think the most important legacy of all this is going to be? It's a sense elsewhere in the world that this country can now deliver what it promises, and to a really high standard. And William Hague has a lovely statistic. I think it was 46 consecutive world leaders or foreign ministers that were ringing to speak to him about some event. And before they had even spoken about that, they said, before we start, I'd just like to say well done on the best Olympic and Paralympic Games. And the difference that has made to our reputation internationally is something that is going to stand us in very good stead for many years to come.
Thank you. It's very interesting the way this limited innovation message is being picked up in our executive summit.
We've read the report, haven't we?
It's very impressive. But we were having a discussion earlier just about some of the lessons of the report, and I think actually the sort of message about control and managing innovation actually is probably a better message rather than innovate for the sake of it. So I think if we were writing it again, which we're not, we would do that. So I think that's a very important message. Now, your opportunity to ask questions, comments, etc. I'm not sure whether there are people in the other room. If there are, and they want to ask any questions, maybe they'd like to come their way in here. But we've got some roving mics lurking around. So we're going to take them in clutches in the way. So we seem to have a very keen quadrant down front. So they're clearly nearest the stage and therefore most infected. So, yeah, somebody from the other room first. Yes, can you tell us who you are? Okay, that's a very good question. We might hold and we'll take a couple more questions down here. Yep. So we'll go here and then here. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for such a great event. I think it's been really great to hear what the panel have had to say. My name's Tim McLaughlin, and I'm here on behalf of David Hemery. David has founded a charity called 21st Century Legacy, which is now working in, I'm very pleased to say, 87,000 youngsters, a Be the Best You Can Be programme inspired by the Games. I would like to ask the panel for their advice on how we can extend our programme. We've already spoken to Baroness Sue about including the Top Sport programme. It's available in primary and secondary schools. And also I'd like to extend the invitation to everyone. We've got a reception in the House of Lords on the 23rd of April. And I'd be very grateful to invite anybody who would like to extend our programme, which is doing exactly what Katherine said, harnessing the inspiration in schools. As Sue said, that would be the true lasting legacy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And further along.
Thank you. I'm Jason Keane. I used to work at Lowcock. In September, Alistair Campbell called for David Cameron to create a department for sport with its own Secretary of State. Do the panel think that that would help us to improve sport rather than the current situation where ministers have to juggle tourism and the Leveson inquiry with sport and Olympic legacy?
Okay, yes, one more. Just go back and then we'll do that. So,
Robert Morland, I think it may sound bizarre, but my interest here comes from the fact that I'm a member of the Canal and Rivers Trust for Wales, South Wales and the Severn. And it really comes back to the point that we've heard about London, but what about the legacy outside, and I mean even outside of the venues? Because coming from Gloucestershire, we have a lot of medalists, not least of all rowing medalists. And we have a boat club in Gloucester, which since August has simply been inundated by schools, everyone under the sun wanting to row, and it actually has had a big function to raise funds, but actually is having great difficulty in coping with that and coming up with it. And I wonder if there's been enough thought about that kind of impact in terms of the legacy.
Yeah, I might throw in one question. I tweeted out that that we were doing this event, #MakingTheGames, and asked if there are any questions out there. And one question was whether one of the threats to legacy was cuts in local funding of sports facilities. I think the example there was given something in the Don Valley from Patrick Butler
It's
on the Guardian.
Yeah. Don Valley, yeah.
So, Hugh, do you want to just have first?
Yes. Shall
first
I
go at
run
some
down
of those?
that list? What is my greatest? How much of the press have we got here?
Some.
This is
It's
right,
on the
okay.
record.
I think the
Just a
thing
warning.
it is absolutely important to get right is school sport. An honest answer to it. And actually, if you look at the sports legacy plan, if you look at the 10 pillars, there is some incredibly encouraging news across the rest of it. You know, we've even managed to get 750,000 more people playing sport in the year over the games. The funding for elite athletes has gone up by 11%. International inspiration that Tessa helped to set up, some of the things we've talked about. There is more work to do on school sport, if I'm honest. David Emery's charity, have a look. You want to apply, you may get, well, of course it's a school programme, isn't it? So you can't get the money out of Sport England because its remit doesn't extend that far. The big lottery fund are about to make some money available for an Olympic legacy project. So I should have a look at that, talk to Peter Ainsworth. The Ministry for Sport, that's a hardy perennial. I think that's been going around for as long as we've all been involved in it. The problem is that as soon as you have a Ministry for Sport, you will also, the arts lobby will want one, the tourism lobby will want one, the heritage lobby will want one, the new media lobby will want one, and everything else like that. Actually, you might say, given where sport is at the moment, on the back of the Olympic Games, it hasn't done too badly. You're looking a bit cynical. We just delivered the best Olympic and Paralympic Games, arguably, that anybody has ever done. We have the longest list of major events coming to this country. I mean, the World Rowing Championships are coming here in both 2013 and 2015 because they were so impressed with the organisation, the way Eton Dorney was run. There is a huge success story there. The legacy outside London, it's always going to be more tricky. You can't win an Olympics unless you bid with a capital city. And so there simply was really no option there. One of the very clever things that LOCOG did was to set up the Nations and Regions Group. There were over 2,000 inspired by schemes that came out of that. Sport England has a funding scheme called Places People Play that precisely exists to give small grants of £50,000 or under to people who want to do up make small improvements to sports facilities. So if you've got lots of people in your rowing club, you should be applying to them. The England Rowing have also just received a wodge of funding from the new Whole Sport Plan, which will be available. That is there precisely to address participation. So you want to have a talk to them. And cuts in local authority budgets, yes. It's very difficult. One of the frustrations, if I'm honest, of being a government minister is that you have to do it against the current economic backdrop. But there isn't a great deal that one can do about that because we are where we are. And the key thing is to make the most of it. And I know this is incredibly tough for local authorities. The Don Valley issue is one of those classic issues where you've had an old stadium that hasn't had money put into it for a very long time. So you leave it doing nothing, and then there's a larger bill at the back end, which is very difficult in the current financial climate. All we can do is to put some of this money aside through Sport England's facilities budget. It won't remotely probably match what may be lost in local authorities, but I would simply say to local authorities, this is the time to invest in sport, and you've got to make some tough decisions over this. I hope very much that people won't disinvest in sport at a time when there is more interest in it than there's ever been.
So, Catherine, big challenge. Does this point resonate about sort of lots of demand and?
It does. One of the first things I did after we won our medal was there was a big thing in Henley with a big rowing centre, and where there was a few athletes doing a sort of Q&A thing, and someone stood up and said, I work in development in a different region of England, and it's been wonderful. We've been absolutely inundated with so many people wanting to learn to row. It's wonderful. We've got hundreds of people on the waiting list, and I just thought, unbelievably brilliant that so many people are interested. Absolutely awful that they're on a waiting list because nobody's going to wait forever. You've been inspired by this incredible event. You want to be down there on the water, on a boat, on the rowing machine or something. And the fact people are sitting on waiting lists, I think, is probably for me actually one of the biggest challenges we have. Is it's been so much of a success, it was almost by surprise. You know, what we want is people to get engaged with sport, take part, try for themselves, and the awful thing is that people don't get that chance to. So for me, it's finding a way to stop people being on waiting lists and get people actually doing it before we lose them. Because I wouldn't expect anyone to last forever.
Sue? You know, it's translating all that inspiration into participation, and I think for me, whether we're talking school sport or community sport, if we're inspired people, we've got to have better trained teachers and better trained coaches, and we've got to have more of them. And I guess that's a mistake or a lack of foresight, really, that we didn't get that in place, because we know from other experiences that youngsters won't wait, and they come down and that experience isn't great because there aren't enough coaches, they don't get enough chance to have a go. Unfortunately, they're in this instant culture where that means they don't come back again. So, you know, if there's a gap in our forward thinking, it was perhaps getting the people on the ground that could absorb that inspiration and turn it into participation. One of the things about this Department for Sport, and you know, as the Minister quite rightly says, if if we'd taken £1 for every time we've been asked that, we'd all be very rich. I think Katherine said something really important though when she was doing her piece, and that is that sometimes we see sport as performance, and of course it is, but I'm a great believer that sport does change lives, and I do believe it is about health. I do believe it's about community cohesion. I do believe it's about crime. I do believe it's about inclusion. And so if you did a Department of Sport, that would somehow have to be a cross-government working sort of mechanism. And all my experience is that interdepartmental working, other than around the Olympics, is blooming difficult to make happen. And you know, if you look at something like school sport, Department of Health, Department of Culture, Media, Sport, Department for Education, they've all got a role to play, but it becomes a little bit of a jostling match as to who's going to do it. And one of the great lessons we must learn from the Olympics is that sport has a way of creating a coalition, of making things happen across government. So I'm not sure whether the Department of Sport would isolate sport or whether it would make this coalition more real, but it's a coalition we need, a coalition of effort, if we're truly going to maximise the impact of sport. And cuts in local funding, the Minister's answered that. I mean, it's a massive challenge, and I go around, I've just done a whole series of talks around the country. It's a huge challenge. But what it does mean is we have to make the most of what we've got. And quite often, again, because of territorial differences between leisure departments and education departments and other departments, we don't work collaboratively at a local level. There are some great facilities now in schools for sport that we have to maximise and use. So we may be closing a court over here, but there's some down the road, and the message has got to be, it's got to be coalition, working locally, maximising the use. So the lessons from the Olympics were clear. If we work together, nothing can stop us. And if we pull away in part, then actually we waste huge energy and we don't produce the results we need to. So it's a coalition of purpose for me.
Neale, big challenge.
Yeah, just a big on the big challenge point. I mean, I think it's like the big challenge that probably faces every substantial regeneration project, which is always the problem about how do you ensure that the benefits that you're trying to generate actually do have a broad impact, that people who have been living in the area for a long period of time, people who are suffering from particular problems of deprivation or inequalities in the areas, how do you ensure that they benefit and not just people who are able to access new facilities and new housing in the areas? It's a real hard thing in any regeneration project. It's about making sure that we do maintain the right levels of affordable housing, the right types of affordable housing, that we do get more jobs into some of the developments that we see, that they're not all purely housing led. We're very concerned to have another look at that. And it's all about skills, schools, education as well, and making sure that we really do achieve some of the ambition that the boroughs down there have, the ambition that they have to try and ensure that over the next 20 or 30 years the quality of life in that part of London comes up to the same as the quality of life across the rest of London.
Okay, let's go to some more questions. Yes, we'll go here. David? Yeah, no, stop there. Yes. Yeah, David. Yeah.
Hello, my name is David Pitchford. I'm the head of the Major Projects Authority for the UK government. And according to you, Jill, I stand here as a decayed Australian. So my question goes to a bit of that decay, and it's for Katherine and Sue, basically. A flippant observation on the way through is if you want to look for some of the very good Australian Olympic coaches, you have to look overseas, unfortunately. But the other quirky question I've got, particularly for you, Katherine, but it goes to coaching, so it goes to Sue as well. And that part of the decay in Australia is this very unusual happening of the impact of Masters Games in relation to competitors. And one of the decay elements here is that in the sport that I used to play, water polo, and in surf lifesaving, which unfortunately is not Olympic, otherwise we'd eat you at that. But in terms of the other sports, this phenomenon that's occurring where people no longer give up and go on into coaching and become fundamentally important, and there's this huge strand that they go on sometimes into their 70s and 80s and compete individually. And what I've noticed is that the amount of coaches that come forward out of great careers like yours is becoming less and less and less. And I'm wondering whether you think this is an issue for the legacy from these games, because our games were 12 years ago, and sure, our government's possibly taken its eye off the ball in terms of funding, but this is a social phenomenon that the sports are going to have to manage. Can I have a view, please?
Right. Let's ask a couple more questions. That's a fascinating, different insight. Yeah.
Chris Bailey, Chair of Sports Coach UK. I pick up on the earlier question, but Sue won't be surprised that I absolutely applaud more and better coaches. My question for Sue, and indeed for others in the panel, is: Are we bolting? Are we closing the door after the horse has bolted? What are we going to do now, bearing in mind the constraints that Hugh has mentioned, to increase the numbers? To pick up on the question of coaches, 75% of those coaching in this country are volunteers. I mean, the professional cadre is very, very small. They're extremely good, and indeed a number of them are Australian. However, it's the volunteers that we rely on, and we've got to somehow encourage. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and behind you.
Hello, Graham Kinshot from DCLG. Picking up on something Neale just said, I'd like to ask about whether the legacy company or GLA have got any plans to evaluate the regeneration legacy, because there's parts in place from the DCMS overarching valuation, parts from the LDA and parts from DCLG, but it's just like how we're going to take that forward and how you see those plans developing.
Okay, right, well, it sort of splits up quite nicely. So, Katherine, Sue, sort of old competitors don't give up, they just go on and on into masters programs and don't become
Poor
coaches.
Katherine being linked to me. Sorry, Katherine.
Old competitors never give up.
Well, that's what David just said.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. My coach is an Australian, although he's now a British citizen as well. So things like the Ashes, he's in a win-win. He's fine. We'll see about that. Or lose-lose. It's a really interesting one. I think partly, for example, in my sport, there's no elite female coaches at the kind of international level. I think that's a major thing missing. I think an element of it is because we have lottery funding and we can be full-time athletes, most people who get to the end of their career will have given their lives to it to some extent. Now, when you finally stop, say in my sport, it's a 6 or 7 day week training program from very early in the morning till late afternoon. When you stop, the bit you look forward to is not having to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and not having to spend weeks abroad on training camps or in competitions and things. And if anything, certainly the coaches I work with, they give in more time than we do as athletes, because when we're resting in between training sessions, they're planning the next training program, and it's absolutely massive demanding role to play. And I'd echo what Sue said before, they are utterly crucial. We would not have the success we had without the coaches we have in place. What the hardest thing is to see, and I feel very lucky. I'm in a generation where we have incredibly strong British athletes, currently amazing role models, amazing names, and to lose them from sport would be a huge loss when they get to the end of their careers. Now, I think, as far as I'm aware, everyone I know who's getting close to retirement or planning to retire, all want to give something back to sport. So whether it's going around schools or talking in different areas, everyone wants to give back because everyone has gained so much from being part of sport. And that goes without saying, but it's still a big step to commit to it from the coaching point of view. Now, I don't know how to change that ethos because, as much, I don't know what I would do. I always thought, certainly as an athlete, you kind of have an us and them mentality. I would never be a coach. They're all bastards, a lot of them. Whereas I think the more you work with them, the more experience you get, the more knowledgeable you get. You have this huge respect for what they do and how difficult it is at the job. It's a really, really challenging job to do. And to be honest, if they get it right, if they get it absolutely right, they'll probably not be known. They are absolutely about putting their athletes forward. And some of the best coaches I know step right back and don't want the limelight at all, just want to have their role. As an athlete going into that world, it's different as well because you're used to being the centre of what you do, and then going into that sort of role is a very different role to move into. But I think you're right. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we do need to harness athletes, especially in this country when the standard of athletes are getting better and better and better every single year. To then lose them to sport completely is too much of a loss. But I don't know what the answer is to keep hold of them.
So, I think those are really interesting insights, actually. Two things have helped us retain our coaches, I think. We were concerned post-London that we would have an exodus back the other way, or indeed to other places. And that was the assurance we got during the Games that our government funding was secure for the next 4 years. And that made a huge difference because it immediately sent a message into the system. The system is safe, and because the athlete coaches particularly want to work in these 4-year cycles. So it's not like an annual review process. So the fact that the minister was able to secure that 4-year guaranteed funding made a huge difference to our ability to retain our Australian coaches in the British system. I take your point about the Masters situation and the fact that people, in a way, our desire to keep people playing and participating almost works against our desire to get people into coaching. I take the point you're making. We've developed at UK Sport an elite coach programme, which is now both tracking and managing every coach who works with elite athletes and providing them with either personalised support, workshop support, professional development. But to pick up Chris's point, beneath that sort of pyramid of excellence at the top, the elite coach programme, so many of those coaches are volunteers, and we still don't really in this country have a profession of coaching. If you go to Europe or America, the coach is a licensed professional. They're God. In America, the coach is more important than the President of the United States. The coach of sorry about that, but he is. The coaches are really important. Here, the coach is still quite, as Katherine said, they're the backroom people somehow, hidden. And we haven't developed that profession. I'm passionate about it, as Chris knows, that is absolutely critical. And I don't mean by professionalising, you rule out volunteers, but you have to have a professionalised structure which allows everybody, even if it's the interested mum and dad who comes in wearing a tracksuit on a Saturday, with an opportunity to progress should they wish. And until we have that, Catherine's other issue, which is we haven't got enough women in coaching, and certainly we have a lot at the grassroots, but they don't progress. That's because the pathways aren't clear. So there's some big issues there for us in coaching. I never think we've shut the, what did you say, when the horses, but I never believe that. You know me, I'm a great optimist. I believe you can always sort it out. But coaching for me is critical, and I think you've raised some really important issues, and Catherine's insights are equally important there, I think.
Neale, do you want to pick up this point about generation legacy?
Yeah, I'm in some ways, I'm a bit of an evaluation skeptic. I think if you look at some of the evaluation that has been done around the project, I think it's probably been paid for by your department.
I fear it has.
There's some very, very thick and complicated reports which look at sort of counterfactuals and things like this, and I'm not sure they're really all that useful. They are, they're interesting, but I'm I think there, on the other hand, there is a huge amount to be done about learning from good practice and what works and acknowledged good practice. And we don't do enough of that. I mean, for example, we did a huge amount of work during the run-up to the games with LOCOG and with the boroughs and with the local job brokerages, trying to get local people into the Olympic jobs. And it was actually a very successful program. I mean, it was hugely successful. And we desperately need to get everyone together in the next month or so and sit down and really have a proper focus on how do we learn from what we did well in that and so on. Equally, I dearly love all the employers, all the significant number of medium sized employers in the retail businesses in that area to learn from how John Lewis goes about recruiting disabled people. It's just remarkable what they do. They're a stunning organisation, and learning from that and trying to transfer it into other places. And similarly, one of the things I hope we can really do in the park, I talked about us having this desire to get a higher education institution into the park, and that's partly because we really want to have someone on site who is interested in getting into issues around health and sport in schools and whatever, and with older people indeed. And I think if we can establish that sort of thing, it's something that you can easily then replicate. So I'm very keen on that sort of approach, I suppose, which is about evaluation and learning and so on, and being open to innovation, and particularly about trying to involve as many people as possible, the users of services and local people in that process. And I think that's a better process than some of the highly academic evaluation work that goes on, which I probably have less time for.
Yeah. Are you not worried that the NAO will come forward in 10 years' time saying...
They just have. They just have.
Well, yes, I am worried about that, but I don't think paying academics to construct castles in the air is going to really help very much in answer the NAO's questions. We've got some very clear work which we will do on measuring the outputs and outcomes of the work that we do in and around the park. We're monitoring and tracking a whole range of quality of life indicators with the boroughs. We've done a lot of work on improving that sort of outcome-focused monitoring and work. But then you tell me, how do you track the influence of the Olympic investment on that as compared with what's happened to the value of the pound sterling in the last 24 months? So no, and anyway, we're not accountable to the NAO, so I'm not worried about that.
I think that's the crucial bottom line. I'm very keen to get a couple more questions in before we have to close.
Just very quickly on this. The NAO have, of course, just reported, and well done, the Permanent Secretary who guided through this. The fact you may not have heard of it is a testimony to the work of the Permanent Secretary, because you managed to bury one of those reports. That's a very good day's work. The question on coaching, actually don't despair on this. Like Sue, I'm an optimist. If you look at the sport of hockey, I think almost every single one of their coaches is an ex-international. I talked to Catherine's performance director the day that the regatta had finished down at Eton Dorney. He wasn't coming up to the park for the next week to sort of enjoy enjoy all the plaudits of having qualified every single team for a final. He was off to the junior rowing championships in Slovenia or somewhere, or Poland or somewhere like this, to look at the next generation during the second week of the tournament. There are some incredibly devoted coaches out there, and the system that Sue has put in place, I think, means that we'll see more of them. The coaching succession chart looks pretty good. And before everybody gets depressed about participation, do just remember that we have just put 750,000 people on the participation base. No other host nation has done that.
Okay.
And here we are beating ourselves up about it.
We're going to have...
from the Active People Survey, November 2011 to November 2012.
We're going
it's
to
there,
have...
I promise you, it's there. Go look at it right.
We're going to have... we're running up against our deadline, so I want to take a very quick round. So I'm going to ask people to ask questions incredibly quickly, and then the panel can do some speed answering. So yes, there, and then there.
If it's okay, it's an observation or a plea rather than a question, so I'll be very quick. Karen Lacey, I was the Nations and Regions Coordinator for the South East. We talked about local authorities making cuts. Many of them in the South East are doing the opposite, in fact, inspired by the Games. In fact, one of the county councils, they submitted their their submission for their business plan for the next 3 years, and it got rejected by the council for not being ambitious enough. So they are looking to invest, and if we don't keep them in the loop and keep them informed, they may drift and do their own thing. So, thank you.
Great, thanks. Yes.
Richard Summery, been involved in this for a little while. My view is you really can't gauge legacy, and probably won't be able to for about 30 years, possibly. And so my question is, what the panel think they want to have achieved in that 30-year period. For me, for example, it's not just about the Olympic Park, it's about kick-starting regeneration down the whole of the Thames Gateway, and what can we do there. It's about the transformation of London, the way people perceive it as a city, and how we can sustain that. It's about long-term sustainability of participation in sport and the relationship between sport and all the things that Sue was earlier talking about, so, you know, reducing crime, the social benefits of sport, etc., etc. The use of volunteering, which I think is already a missed opportunity, unfortunately, to galvanise all of those people who were involved. So what is it that the panel think in 30 years' time they would like to have seen as being the real legacy emanating from London?
So, that's a very good question for the sort of final remarks of all the panellists. Yes,
Roger Dole, Better Government Initiative, previously Department for Education. Just on the wider legacy issue, and perhaps a question mainly for the Minister, what are the prospects of learning the lessons for government from this exercise and extending them more widely in terms of personnel stability, political cooperation, limiting innovation, and using arm-length bodies?
Okay, thank you very much. So I think there's brilliant questions to be ending on. So what is the sort of long-term legacy you'd like to see if we're all here in 30 years' time talking about this again? And Hugh, is our report going to be part of legacy? Is there any chance that anyone will do anything as a consequence of this?
Well, I mean, I think the long-term legacy we all want to see is the legacy that Seb K laid out in Singapore, which is to inspire a generation to take up sport. And that should be, I think it'll be very difficult to judge that in 3 years, arguably in 5, but I think we should have I'm not sure I'd go quite as far as 30. I think by, in a decade's time, we'll know whether that's works or not. Talk about volunteering. I don't be pessimistic about volunteering. I saw the other day that I think 50,000 of the games makers or something like that have already put their names forward to volunteer at the Commonwealth Games. The Rugby World Cup in 2015 is having huge interest off that volunteering database. So, and they're on a database. They're constantly being contacted by LOCOG with all sorts of opportunities that come their way. So I think providing we're realistic about what we ask them to do, there's no reason why that goes wrong and should go wrong. Learning lessons from 2012, I think you've actually summed this up very well in the conclusion. There undoubtedly are a huge number of lessons for government to learn from the delivery of the 2012 project. I mean, Tessa would have a view on that as well. You just have to remember, in these sort of heady days of optimism, that this was quite a special project. I mean, I'll completely embarrass Tessa. One of the extraordinary things about it, Tessa is a Labour politician, I'm a Conservative one. She's probably one of my very best friends in politics, and it takes quite a special project to bring that together. That will not always be the case across government, is all I would say. Yeah.
Okay, Katherine.
I guess I'd love us to still be talking about it in 30 years' time, but not in a historical way, not in a, wasn't that great 30 years ago? Didn't we have the best summer ever? I'd want people to be sitting here talking about their Olympic gold medals, because they watched something 30 years before. I'd love people to be talking about their children who are taking part in stuff because they were inspired by something that happened 30 years ago. We keep saying, it has a power to change lives. I would love, not just in sport, I'd love people who go on to become architects because they saw the Zaha Hadid's amazing swimming pool design. People who went on to do incredible things in music because they watched Emily Sandé walk on in front of that 80,000 stadium and silence it instantly. There were so many moments that captured the country that I hope in 30 years' time we are still being inspired by it.
It's almost good enough to finish there, really. It's really good. I would want us still to have a very successful high-performance system so that Catherine's successors I nearly said something else. Successors are still inspiring a generation of people, but I really hope that through a coalition of effort, through a real understanding of the power of sport, that it can have this huge impact on the lives of this nation, as it did, that we can capture that and really ensure that the inspiration is turned into very meaningful participation for future generations through the way we invest in our teachers, our coaches, and our individuals, who in the end are the inspiration for people to participate and continue. So I hope we have a great high-performance system, but a great ability to translate that into a generation of young people who are healthy, happy, socialised, and enjoy being part of this great nation.
So Neale, in 30 years' time, we might be bidding for it again.
Or even before. I mean, I've already mentioned the ambition which the boroughs and the mayor and indeed the government have enunciated around the aim that the quality of life in East London should be the same as in the rest of London, which is a very ambitious agenda indeed, and would be a phenomenal legacy and could well take 30 years or more to achieve. But I suppose I don't actually. I think one of the things people talk about the legacy around the Olympic Park often in terms of it being a 20 or a 30-year project, and I actually think that's probably the wrong approach. I actually think our ambition around the park should be to accelerate the development there. We should be looking to build out the housing very much faster. We should be looking to bring more jobs into that the park because of its unique ability to create a new metropolitan centre in Stratford. Because if we can do that quickly, the catalytic effect on the rest of the Lee Valley and on the surrounding area will be enormous, and you will see a huge acceleration in regeneration. So I actually think the immediate challenge is to try and get on with things more quickly, particularly, and focus the energy on the benefits you can get in and around the park, because it is a unique opportunity still, and it's one that has a genuine global reach. If we go out, for example, to try and find people to build, 2,000 or 3,000 homes around the Northern Park, as we may well do this year, that's something that is a genuine global investment opportunity. And the way in which we've seen, for example, at Westfield, big pension funds from overseas putting money into that part of London, which a few years ago people would have laughed at you if you'd said that would have happened. The face of this place has changed, and actually I suppose one thing which would be good to see in 30-year time, which I think is beginning to happen, is Stratford isn't part of East London, it's part of central London really, and that's how it should be seen. It's as much a part of central London as many areas which are much more normally seen as that. We've changed the view of Stratford, and we need to change the opportunities for people who live there, and and not see them as marginal anymore.
Okay, well, just to conclude, first of all, could I encourage you all to, if you've been interested in today, to read our report. These are our lessons, different to them. If you have different takes on them, we'd be very interested to hear from you. Any other lessons you've missed, lessons you'd like to modify, we'd be very interested in getting a debate going. If you want to contribute anything, we're very happy to take that. So please, that's available on the Institute for Government website. The second thing I want to do is I want to give a big thank you to our sponsor tonight, C2HM Hill, who also get mentioned, were part of the CLM consortium key to delivering the Olympic Park and the venues, very kindly sponsored tonight's event, and you'll be benefiting from their generosity when you go outside in 1 second to enjoy some Institute for Government canapes and wine. The final thing I, of course, want you to do, though, is to thank our absolutely fantastic panel for sharing their views with us tonight. So thank you.